I want to start today in 23 BC, over 2,000 years ago, with a Latin poet from the end of the Roman Republic at that point, really the beginning of the Roman Empire, almost. His name was Quintus Horatius Flaccus. He's known generally in the English language as Horace. And this guy was a poet. He was really a bureaucrat as well. He was a very wealthy guy. He was formerly a treasury official in Rome. Managed to enrich himself tremendously, and he wrote some poems that come down to us through the ages. His most famous is called Odes, and in Book 3 of Odes, which was written in 23 BC, Horace was trying to motivate the Romans to sort of rise up and become, expert military, almost like the way the Spartans were bred to be trained killers, lethal fighting forces from the time that they were born. Rome had had its share of warfare, and one of its constant enemies was the Parthian Empire. There was an old guy named Mithridates from about 100 years before Horace was around that was constantly antagonizing the Romans. And so Horace wrote this poem, Odes, in Book 3. One of the things that he wrote in there, he says, this is a translation, but he says, "To suffer hardness with good cheer, in sternest school of warfare bred, our youth should learn, let steed and spear make him one day the Parthians dread. Cold skies, keen perils, brace his life. Methinks I see from rampart town some battling tyrant's matron wife, some maiden look in terror down. Ah, my lord, untrained in war! O tempt not the infuriate mood of that fell lion I see. From far he plunges through a tide of blood. What joy for fatherland to die! Death's darts, even flying feet overtake, nor spare recreant chivalry, a back that cowers or loins that quake." Key line here, what joy for fatherland to die. There's a lot of ways to translate that. In Latin, it's dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. Many ways it's translated. You could say, what joy for fatherland to die, or what most people say, it is sweet and fitting to die for your country. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for your country. Of course, Horace, the treasury official, was perfectly fine for Romans to go and fight and die. He wanted them to buck up to fight the Parthians, in case, as the second coming of Mithridates should happen to threaten the Roman Empire again. Of course, it's very easy for Horace to say, given that it was other people who would be doing the fighting and the dying. He was a poet and a treasury official, so, what did he have to go and spill his blood in war for when there's plenty of other people who were going to go and do it? And I wanted to bring this up because I was in Estonia for the last several days, and I had some time before through the weekend. It's now Monday, and our entrepreneurship camp is starting this week, so I knew I'd have to make my way to Lithuania. And I had spent some time in Ukraine earlier last week, but I wanted to go back again. It was really actually the third time for the summer that I was back, just in the last couple of months. And the third time, I really wanted to go back one last time, because Ukraine is a place that just absolutely fascinates me. And if you listen to the last podcast, I wrote to you that I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, really for the last 10 years. My father had built a business there, and when he was very sick, I tried to actually help run it for him. And I have a long history with Ukraine. In many ways, you could call it a love-hate relationship. The country has changed so much over the last 10 plus years, and I still know so many people there. And I really wanted to go back one last time and spend some time again in Kiev, because there's just so many things that don't make sense about what's happening in Ukraine. It was interesting because while I was flying there, this pilot on Ukraine International Airways, he gets on the mic and he says, of course they make all the captain announcements, tell you we're gonna take a left through Minsk and to take a right through here, and and everybody's just fly the plane. Nobody's going to know the difference or really care. And at the end of it, he says, "Slava Ukraini." And he's saying this actually in Ukraine, which is kind of interesting because, of course, Ukrainian is the national language of Ukraine, but so many people, particularly in Kiev, sort of the lingua franca, even their native tongue is actually Russian. So now you've got the pilot speaking Ukrainian, and he says this Slava Ukraini, which translated basically means glory for Ukraine. This turns out to be now the big rallying cry across the country. You hear people saying this all the time: "Glory for Ukraine, Slava Ukraini." And what you're supposed to do when somebody says "Slava Ukraini," you're supposed to say "Heroyam Slava," glory for the heroes. So somebody says "Glory for Ukraine," and they respond with "Glory for heroes." And this is ultimately what people have kind of this is what it's been distilled into. It's been distilled into people quoting these kind of sayings back and forth to one another, motivating one another. Having this social proof for making the case, this big social case for war and why we need to go to war and why we need to kill rebels and defend the homeland and all these sort of pithy platitudes that people throw out there. And it's the exact same thing that's happening in Syria. You've got these people in Damascus that are being told they need to rally behind their president and support the homeland, and it's so that the soldiers can fight the rebels and bring peace and all this sort of stuff. And when you do these sorts of things and you convince people in this cause that's righteous, you're on the side of right, glory for Ukraine, glory for heroes, and you get an entire population that believes this, you can convince them to do anything. And frankly, if you think back even in our own modern history, you think about what happened even in the United States after 9/11, people would have done anything. And this is obviously a different case, but the same sort of level of social proof is really being built in to Ukraine. And now politicians are coming in. I told you this last week. They're mobilizing. Now they're telling the civilian population, get ready. They're mobilizing all these people to go, obviously, off to the front line so they can fight and die. And you're starting to see this now, actually, everywhere, even in Kiev, and it's all over in the papers and in the local hospitals. And you're seeing guys coming back with their limbs blown off and so forth. And so the government's going, and now they've passed. Of course, the government's nearly broke, and so they've gone and they're trying to raise at least $1 billion, which in Ukraine is a lot of money. And so they're trying to raise this money so they can go and fight the war. And we covered this last week. They already lost Crimea. Now they've lost Donbass region, which constitutes literally billions of dollars worth of tax revenue to the Ukrainian government. And so they want to go get that money. They want to get that money, and so they want to go. They're happy to go and fight, because if you can spend $1 billion to fight a war that's going to recapture billions of dollars in tax revenue, that's a pretty good return on investment, right? If you're a politician who's got to make a strictly economic decision, we can spend $1 billion and get, secure billions of dollars, multiples of that in tax revenue year after year. That's a good deal for you as a politician. Besides, it's not your blood you're spilling. So what have they done? Now they've imposed a temporary war tax. Of course, anytime a politician tells you we're going to have a temporary anything, you can pretty much bet that that's going to be permanent. They're going to make that permanent in some capacity. So I've got a temporary war tax, all kinds of temporary, quote, temporary provisions. They've farmers now. They're going after the farmers, and they're now taxing farmers on grain exports. Not entirely sure what that has to do. Grain exports has to do with warfare, but now they're taxing farmers on grain exports. They had a big tax. A big increase to the tax. I think they increased the tax they already had on iron extraction by 50%. They added a big increase, a huge increase in tax on oil extraction, natural gas, all kinds of things. So higher taxes. But if you're just a wage earner, if you got a job, whether if you're in the private sector, public sector, it doesn't matter. Everybody's going to have to pay the war tax now. So now you're going to see less money from your salary in your pocket, and all of it's going to go for bombs and bullets and all that sort of thing. And of course, this is very problematic in Ukraine right now. The reason why is because Ukraine, for the last, let's say 12 to 18 months or so, has been in a pretty significant inflationary cycle. Classic inflationary cycle. We've seen a lot of asset prices go up. Which is what happens in inflationary cycles. You see, stocks go up. You see the prices of real estate go up. Real estate in Ukraine has gone up a lot. It's in a bubble. It's gotten very expensive, a lot more expensive than it used to be in Ukraine. So there's been a significant asset price inflation, but at the same time, there's also been very significant retail price inflation. So let's think about this for a minute. Who does this screw, right? If you're in an inflationary cycle where basically the prices of everything, assets, retail prices, food, fuel, everything, all this stuff goes up. Who does that affect? Who does this screw? Well, if you're a rich guy, right, and you spend, let's say you make $1 million a year, and it only costs you $50,000 to live, right? So you're spending 5% of your income on living expenses. 95% of your income is left over to go and invest, right? So you take 5% of your income, $50,000, and you spend that on your rent and going, putting your kids in school and food and so forth. Now you've got $950,000 remaining. And you put that in the stock market, right? And so the stock market goes up by, let's say all prices go up by 10%. Okay, great. So your stocks, you just made $95,000 on your stocks. Meanwhile, your living expenses went up by, you used to be $50,000. Now it's going to cost you an extra 10%, right? So your living expenses went up by $5,000. So you made $95,000 on your investment because of inflation, but your living costs go up by $5,000, which means inflation makes you net positive $90,000. So you just basically made $90,000 because of inflation. So you look at this and you think, okay, that sounds pretty good, right? Sounds pretty good to be a rich guy in an inflationary cycle. Now let's think about, the average guy, right? The average guy, he's got to spend whatever, let's say $15,000 a year in Ukraine to live, and he makes barely $15,000 a year, right? So now his living costs go up by 10%. So now the guy's got to spend $16,500 to live, but he's only making $15,000 a year still. So what does this mean for him? Suddenly it means he's got to make some very difficult decisions. And I have a lot of friends who are in this case right now, people I know with families and so forth, and it's difficult because they're sitting there and they're saying, okay, I've got a daughter who's sick. I've got a business I'm trying to run. I've got some income I'm trying to earn. I've got to put food on the table. I've got rent to pay. I've got utilities. I've got lights and so forth. And those are hard decisions that you have to make of what you choose to pay and what you choose to not pay. I'm not going to be able to buy the right medicine for my daughter so that I can put food on the table for the rest of my family. And those are very hard decisions to make. So in an inflationary cycle, obviously it's the normal guy that really gets hosed, and very wealthy people do incredibly well. But what's happened now is that actually probably the best way I can illustrate that is the transition, because what's happening now is Ukraine is transitioning from this inflationary cycle to a stagflationary cycle. Of course, stagflation is when you have rising prices, but you also have rising unemployment. And normally in an inflationary cycle, things get expensive, get more expensive, and it's because the economy is growing very quickly. Economists always say this; they call the economy overheating, right? This is the sort of metaphor that they use. The economy is overheating, and it's growing too quickly, and oftentimes in an inflationary cycle, you see this in China, we saw this in Indonesia, and a lot of rapidly growing countries. It's because everybody's got a job, and suddenly they're all spending their money, and it's creating all this demand and so forth. And so a lot of times in an inflationary cycle, you at least have people that are doing, maybe the unemployment rate is low because everybody's able to go out and get a job. But what's happening right now is Ukraine is actually transitioning in the wrong direction. It's transitioning from this inflationary cycle to a stagflationary cycle. And I'll give you an example. One of my favorite restaurants, I was actually amazed because I had some friends in town and we were there like on Saturday night in Kiev. And I wanted to take some friends out. One of my favorite restaurants was a place called Food Tourist in Arena City, and it was closed. Found out it's gone. And another one of my favorite places, I used to go to lunch all the time, was a place called L'Entrecôte. This is sort of a French restaurant. They used to have something called the Smart Menu, where for 79 hryvnias in local currency, it was about less than $10. You could get a steak and French fries and a salad and bread and all sorts of stuff. And, that was a hell of a deal for basically less than $10 to get a nice, French cooked steak. It was sizable portions. It was a really good meal. And I spent a lot of time in Ukraine last summer. I generally spend a lot of time in Ukraine pretty much every summer. So last summer I was eating at L'Entrecôte when I was in Kiev practically every day, almost every day for lunch. I'm a creature of habit. And at the time, it was 79 hryvnias, and over the course of time, the price went up from 79 to 89. 89 became 99, and 99 they went out of business because essentially, a multitude of a number of factors basically caused, the currency went into decline, and obviously all the inflation and so forth. the cost just got to be too much. They're looking at this saying, we can't possibly sell this steak anymore for 79 briefness. The price of beef has gone up. Our currency has basically collapsed. And so they kept raising the price and raising the price and raising the price. But there's a problem. And the problem is that while they kept raising their prices, the consumers couldn't afford it anymore because the consumers weren't, it's not like the consumers were getting paid anymore. The consumers suddenly couldn't, it's not like the consumers could afford to pay 89 and 99 and so forth. And so they had decreasing demand and rising costs. And so you reach a certain breaking point in a business where you say, my costs are too significant. I can't cut my costs anymore. I got no customers coming in the door. What am I going to do? Right? I have to close my doors. I have to go out of business. I can't possibly keep this up anymore. So L'Entrecote went out of business, at least the one I used to go to near Arena City. And so what does this mean, right? They had all these people. They had cooks and cleaners and waitresses and very, very, very nice people that worked there. And now they're all out of work, right? Which means that what? Now all of a sudden you've got these people that are out of work. They don't have income anymore. So instead they used to go to the coffee bar next door and they'd hang out and drink a cup of coffee, and so forth. And now guess what? Now the coffee guy doesn't have customers anymore because all of his customers now, they don't have jobs, they don't have money, so they can't buy his coffee. So now the coffee guy doesn't have customers. So what happens? Now the coffee guy's got to go out of business because he lost his customers. And so it creates this kind of chain reaction, this downward spiral where the more people become unemployed, the more people become unemployed. So it creates a significant contraction in the economy. And this is what's really happening in Ukraine right now. The official estimates are 19% inflation and a 6% GDP decline. And I don't think anybody even wants to take a stab at what the unemployment rate is going to be. But it's going to be high. It's already high, and it's getting higher and higher and higher. So think about it like that, right? With the inflationary cycle, at least you still had a job and prices were going up. Now you've got retail price inflation. You've got economic contraction, and you've got rising unemployment. That's pretty much the most horrible set of circumstances you could possibly deal with in an economy. That's what's happening in Ukraine right now. And if it were just that, Ukraine would be actually quite lucky. Unfortunately, it's not, because there's one more huge thing that's going to affect the country, and it's not the war. It's not the war. Of course, the war is a major factor, but the end result of this is that now there's a looming banking collapse in Ukraine. And again, these aren't my numbers. These are numbers that actually come from the banks themselves. In fact, the guy who runs Citibank in Ukraine said that the rate of non-performing loans in the Ukrainian banking system. So these are loans that banks loaned out money to borrowers, and the borrowers aren't paying. They're late on their payments, or they're in default, so forth. Non-performing loans are as high as 40% of all loans in the Ukrainian banking system. This is the head of Citibank in the country said non-performing loans as high as 40%. There's at least 3%, maybe 4% of all banking assets, all Ukrainian banking assets right now are basically trapped in Crimea. You remember the Crimea was what kind of set the whole thing off. That the Crimeans said, we're going to have a vote because we want to be part of Russia. We want to be annexed into Russia. And so now you have all these banking assets that are sort of in this legal limbo where the Ukrainian banks can't really pull them out because you have these assets now that are in Crimea. Now Crimea all of a sudden belongs to Russia. So now all of a sudden it's like you have 3 to 4% of the entire Ukrainian banking assets that might not even really be part of the Ukrainian banking system anymore. So what happens if a bank loses 3 or 4% of its assets? Well, if a bank has really strong levels of capitalization, remember we talk about this all the time. We talk about, banks. I always like to see banks with double-digit levels of solvency and liquidity and so forth. But if a bank only has 3 or 4%, of its entire balance sheet as equity, and they lose 3 or 4% of their assets, they're finished. They're insolvent, right? Which is exactly what happened to Lehman Brothers back in 2008. Lehman Brothers' sort of net equity of the firm was only 3% of its assets. And that meant if Lehman lost 3% of its assets, they were finished. And of course, that's exactly what happened. Their assets, it turns out a lot of the assets they were sitting on were practically worthless. And so they lost all of their equity, and at which point they became insolvent and they went out of business. So if you've got, you've got a banking system that is already poorly capitalized, and they potentially lost 4% of all of their assets, and they've got non-performing loans as high as 40%. According to obviously one of the heads of one of the banks in the country, that is easily enough to render the entire banking system be insolvent. Now, what happens when a banking system goes insolvent? When a banking system goes insolvent, we saw this, we had a front row seat to this in 2008. What happens is there's a deleveraging cycle, right? Asset prices, in many cases, they go up and up and up, real estate prices and stock prices and so forth, because there's so much leverage in the system. Banks have so much cash, and so they're loaning out money left and right. And if banks are making a lot of loans, let's say they're making a lot of loans that go into the housing market, right? They're giving mortgages, you don't have to put 20% down. You can put 1% down and we'll loan you all this money at really, really cheap. We're not going to charge you 8%. We're going to charge you 4%. What happens to the price of houses when money is that cheap and when the bank's giving all this money away? The price of houses goes up. What happens to the stock market when banks are going to big funds and so forth and they're financing a lot of liquidity in the system? Obviously, the price of stocks goes up. And when all of a sudden when banks become insolvent, that leveraging sort of reverses. Somebody hits the brakes on that, and then suddenly there's this massive deleveraging cycle. Now there's no money in the system, right? And that causes the prices of a lot of these things to collapse. And we saw this in 2008. We saw the Dow Jones collapse. We saw housing prices collapse, not only just in the United States, all over Europe, and many places all over the world. So Ukraine has now sort of moved from this inflationary cycle to now being in this stagflationary cycle, where the official, government estimates are 19% inflation, 6% GDP contraction. I think that's fairly optimistic. The currency is basically in free fall. From the first time I was in Ukraine this summer to the second time I was in Ukraine this summer, the currency declined substantially. And even from the second time I was in Ukraine to the third time I was in Ukraine, which is only about a week, the currency declined even further. I mean, this is a currency that could easily go, into free fall and beyond. And so we've moved now, we've moved now into the stagflationary cycle, which is really, that would be the good news for Ukraine. The even worse news is if the banks collapse, which again, there's really overwhelming objective evidence that suggests that a lot of the banking system is actually already insolvent, which is going to cause a deleveraging cycle, which is going to cause, now not only do you have rising retail prices, rising food, rising fuel, rising utility costs, rising taxes, you've got a contracting GDP, you've got businesses going under, you've got rising unemployment, and now you're going to have declining asset prices which could even collapse. And of course, there are Ukrainians, even middle-class Ukrainians, who might own their homes, who all of a sudden now see the value of their homes decline. People feel like they have some kind of savings tied up in the value of their home, and now they're going to see that decline substantially. I mean, this is a major problem in a country that is sort of now today. Ukraine is sort of the Balkans of today. 100 years ago, we were dealing, the world was dealing with World War I, and it was the Balkans. It was Serbia. That was the big problem center. Now it's Ukraine. Very little has changed. And this is enough to really create an entire population of destitute, angry young men who really don't have anything else to do but go out and fight. And you've got, a government that's saying, glory to Ukraine and go and fight and we're mobilizing you and so forth. And hey, what else do you have to do? You got no job. You've got no money, just go out and kill people. And we've managed to rally an entire country, who's there to support you. Glory be to Ukraine. Glory to the heroes. Heroyam slava. You've got an entire country. I mean, they're writing these newspaper articles about all these, these beautiful Ukrainian women who get all dressed up in their finest attire, and instead of going out to the clubs, they're going to the hospitals now. To sit with the soldiers and so forth. I mean, so giving you the sense, go fight for the homeland, go and fight and die. Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It is sweet and fitting to die for your country or perhaps lose a limb. And this is what they're going around and basically telling people now. And again, you're seeing it. We're seeing, guys coming back from the hospital, in the hospitals in Kiev, and it's all over in the papers, and it's even around town. And it is really enough to devastate an entire country. Of course, things are always more complicated on the front line. And there were reports yesterday, the Russian papers are saying that 438 Ukrainian troops from a mechanized infantry unit in Ukraine actually crossed the border into Russia. They were on the front lines there. They crossed the border into Russia to seek asylum. And these things are obviously very, very complicated. It's easy for people who are in the rear. It's easy for politicians. It's easy for Horus, treasury minister. It's easy for, members of parliament, who are just passing laws to raise taxes. It's easy for those guys to say, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. It's very easy for them to say that. It's much more difficult to be the guy, in the trench. And I was thinking about that, in context of all this. And there's a really great poem by an Englishman, an English poet, and an English soldier who fought in World War I. His name was Wilfred Owen. And I'm going to read you this poem, and it's potent. It's incredibly powerful because Owen had the exact opposite view. He was there in the trenches. He saw his friends and comrades get killed. And he wrote in this poem, I'll read this to you. He said, "Bent double, like old beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through the sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on bloodshot. All went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of tired, outstripped 5.9s, that was German artillery, that dropped behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning, this would be under the gas. In all my dreams, before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gargling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the cud of vile, incurable sores on innocent tongues, my friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori. That was Wilfred Owen, and he was killed in action in France exactly 1 week before the armistice was signed in November 1918. And that's one of the realest interpretations, obviously 100 years ago, again, almost to the day, of life in the trenches. It's not glorious. It's very easy for politicians to say, go and fight. We must save the homeland. We must save these invisible lines on a map. We must tax, we must spend, we must build more bombs and more guns, and suffer with 19% inflation and 6% GDP decline and a complete and utter collapse of a banking system. It's quite easy for politicians to do that. But at the end of the day, these wars, in some cases, war is absolutely necessary and it is an unavoidable consequence and conclusion. But this is a war that solves nothing. It really only makes things worse. It's egged on by politicians who tell other people to go and fight and die. It's egged on by an international community because Western Europe and the United States doesn't like Putin. And so you have Ukrainians now that are losing limbs and paying higher taxes and dealing with a collapsed economy over ideals that are being commanded from 10,000 miles away. That's the situation on the ground. I fear it's going to get much worse. This isn't my opinion. This is analysis based on publicly available data and even analysis based on people that are actually very much part of the system, part of the banking system, very high up in the banking system, are telling you that non-performing loans are as high as 40% and that they might have lost 4% of the entire banking assets in Crimea. So the potential for this to get worse, much, much worse, is very, very real in the powder keg of the world right now. And I think this is something that folks should really be paying a lot of attention to. So thanks very much for listening. I think we can cap it there. This was a bit of a downer, but I really had to go back and sort of try and answer some unanswered questions. And next time we have a podcast, I can promise you it's going to be a lot more uplifting because our entrepreneurship camp is coming up in a couple of days. I'm tremendously excited. We've got just over 50 some odd really highly motivated young people from all over the world who are out there and really want to change the world and be a force for good, and not be a force for good by joining government and joining an institution where they feel they have an entitled right to tell other people what they can and cannot put in their body and how much money to confiscate from their pockets and savings, but be a force of good by actually going out and creating value in the world. And one of the things we tell them every year is we say, look, there's two ways, you can kind of make it in the world. You can either create value or you can take it from others. And that's fundamentally, I think, what governments and politicians do. Governments fundamentally make us weak. They make us less safe. They make us more poor. They make us scared of men in caves. They make us hate rebels, people who are just like us. They make us fight one another when no fight is necessary. And ultimately, I feel very pleased to be part of all the young people that are here who are really anxious and excited to learn how to actually create value in the world as opposed to destroying it. So we'll have something that's much more inspiring and much more uplifting next week. And thank you very much for listening.